Sarah Williams rushed through the bustling halls of Milwaukee General Hospital, her comfortable nursing shoes squeaking against the freshly polished floor. It was supposed to be just another ordinary Tuesday in April, but fate had other plans for the 28-year-old nurse. "Nurse Williams, we need you in room 407, called out Nancy, the head nurse, as Sarah passed the nurse's station. "New patient coming in for pre-surgery prep. He's a bit anxious." Sarah nodded and quickly checked her watch. It was 2:45 p.m., and she still had 4 hours left in her shift. She grabbed the patient's chart and made her way to room 407, not knowing that this moment would change her life forever. As she pushed open the door, her eyes fell on a man sitting in a wheelchair next to the window. He was wearing a crisp blue button-down shirt and dark slacks, his appearance neat and professional despite being in a hospital room. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow around him, and Sarah noticed how his deep brown eyes seemed to light up when she entered. "Good afternoon, Mr. Cooper," Sarah said, checking the chart again. "I'm Nurse Williams, but you can call me Sarah. I'll be helping you prepare for tomorrow's procedure." The man smiled, and Sarah couldn't help but notice how it transformed his entire face. "Please call me James," he replied, his voice warm and confident. "And I have to say, you're making this dreary hospital room much brighter already." Sarah felt her cheeks warm at the unexpected compliment. In her 3 years of nursing, she had learned to maintain professional boundaries with patients, but there was something different about James Cooper. Despite being confined to a wheelchair, he carried himself with dignity and charm that seemed to fill the entire room. As Sarah went through the pre-surgery checklist, she learned that James was 32 years old and ran his own software company. He had been paralyzed from the waist down since a car accident when he was 12, but he spoke about it matter-of-factly, without a trace of self-pity. "Tomorrow's procedure is just routine maintenance," James explained, making light of the situation. "When you're in a wheelchair, your body needs occasional tune-ups, like a car." His sense of humor caught Sarah off guard, and she found herself laughing more than she usually would with patients. As she took his vital signs, they talked about everything from their favorite local restaurants to their shared love of old jazz music. "You know," James said thoughtfully, "most people see the wheelchair first and me second. But you've been looking me in the eyes this whole time." Sarah paused while noting his blood pressure readings. "Well, the wheelchair is just how you get around," she replied honestly. "It's not who you are." The words had left her mouth before she could think about them, and for a moment, the room fell silent. James studied her face with an intensity that made her heart beat a little faster. That's exactly it," he said softly. "You know, Sarah, I don't suppose you'd want to grab coffee sometime, after I'm no longer your patient, of course." Sarah knew she should say no. Her mother had always talked about finding a strong man to take care of her, and her friends were constantly trying to set her up with doctors or lawyers. But there was something about James Cooper that made all those voices in her head go quiet. "I'd like that," she heard herself say. As Sarah left room 407 that evening, she felt different somehow. She didn't know that this was just the beginning of an extraordinary journey. She didn't know about the challenges they would face, the prejudices they would overcome, or the incredible secret that would eventually change everything. All she knew was that for the first time in her life, she had met someone who saw the world differently, someone who had turned his obstacles into stepping stones and who looked at her like she was the most fascinating person he'd ever met. Little did Sarah know that this unexpected meeting in room 407 would not only change her life, but would also touch the lives of countless others in ways she could never imagine. 2 weeks after James's successful procedure, Sarah sat nervously at a small table in the hospital cafeteria, waiting for her best friend Lisa to arrive. She hadn't told anyone about her upcoming coffee date with James, but she knew she needed someone to talk to about it. "Girl, what's so urgent?" Lisa asked as she slid into the chair across from Sarah, unwrapping her sandwich. "Your text sounded serious." Sarah took a deep breath. "Remember the patient I told you about, James Cooper?" When Lisa nodded, Sarah continued, "Well, he asked me out for coffee, and I said yes." Lisa's sandwich stopped halfway to her mouth. "The one in the wheelchair?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "Sarah, are you sure about this?" That reaction was exactly what Sarah had been afraid of. She had seen the same look of concern and confusion on people's faces whenever they saw James in his wheelchair. But there was something else too, a hint of judgment when they saw a black woman helping a white disabled man. "He's amazing, Lisa," Sarah said firmly. "He runs his own company, he's funny, and he sees me, really sees me." Lisa reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. "I just don't want things to be harder for you than they already are. You know how people can be." Later that evening, Sarah sat in her small apartment, thinking about Lisa's words. She picked up her phone and saw 3 missed calls from her mother. Taking another deep breath, she dialed back. "Sarah Joy Williams," her mother's voice came through sharp and clear. "Lisa's mother just called me. Have you lost your mind?" "Mama, please listen." "No, you listen. Life is already hard enough for a black woman in this country. Why would you choose to make it harder? And what about children? Have you thought about that?" Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes, but she blinked them away. "Mama, I haven't even gone on a date with him yet. And his disability doesn't define who he is." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. The next afternoon, Sarah met James at a quiet coffee shop downtown. He was already there when she arrived, 2 cups of coffee on the table in front of him. "I hope you like caramel lattes," he said with a smile. "I remembered you mentioned it during one of our talks." Sarah felt her nervousness melt away as they fell into easy conversation. James told her about growing up in a wealthy family that never let his disability stop him from achieving his dreams. He had started his software company from his college dorm room, and now it employed over 50 people. "But what about you?" he asked. "Tell me about your family." Sarah hesitated, then decided to be honest. "They're having trouble understanding this. My mom especially." James's smile faded slightly. "Because I'm in a wheelchair." "That's part of it," Sarah admitted. "And because you're white." James was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "You know," he said finally, "people have been telling me what I can't do my whole life. Can't play sports, can't drive a normal car, can't run a company. But here I am, doing what makes me happy despite what others think." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Sarah, I like you. A lot. I know this won't be easy, and I know people will talk. But I think what we could have might be worth fighting for, if you're willing to try." Looking into his eyes, Sarah saw the same determination she'd noticed that first day in the hospital. She thought about her mother's words, about Lisa's concern, about all the obstacles they would face. But she also thought about how James made her laugh, how he remembered her coffee order, how he looked at her like she was the only person in the room. "I'm willing to try," she said softly, squeezing his hand. Neither of them knew then just how much their decision would cost them, or how it would change not only their lives but the lives of countless others. They only knew that in that moment, holding hands across a coffee shop table, they were choosing to be brave together. 3 months after their first coffee date, Sarah found herself spending most of her free evenings at James's office, watching him work late into the night. His software company, Cooper Technologies, occupied the entire 5th floor of a modern building downtown, and Sarah was amazed by how he had designed everything to be accessible not just for himself, but for all his employees with disabilities. "Watch this," James said one evening, guiding his wheelchair to a specially designed workstation. With a few voice commands and hand gestures, he brought multiple screens to life. "We're creating software that helps people with different abilities work more efficiently. Every barrier we break down means more opportunities for someone else." Sarah sat on a nearby chair, fascinated by the passion in his voice. She had learned that James didn't just run a company, he was changing lives. Half of his employees were people with various disabilities who other companies had overlooked. "Maria over there," he pointed to a woman using a specialized keyboard. "She's our best programmer. Lost her hands in an accident 5 years ago. Nobody would hire her until she came here. Now she's developing programs that will help others like her." As Sarah watched James interact with his team, she felt her heart swell with pride. This was the side of him her family couldn't see, the leader, the innovator, the man who turned his own challenges into opportunities to help others. Later that night, as they shared take-out dinner in his office, James grew serious. "Sarah," he said, placing his fork down, "I need to ask you something." She looked up, noticing the nervous expression on his face. "These past 3 months have been incredible," he continued. "But I know it hasn't been easy for you. The looks we get when we're out together, the whispers, your family's disapproval. He paused, taking a deep breath. Are you sure this is what you want? Sarah moved her chair closer to his wheelchair. James Cooper, are you trying to talk me out of dating you? He smiled slightly, but his eyes remained serious. I'm trying to be realistic. You deserve a life without all these complications. Your mother still won't take your calls, and I saw how hurt you were when your cousin uninvited you from her wedding. Listen to me, Sarah said firmly, taking his hand. Yes, it hurts when my family acts this way. Yes, it's frustrating when people stare at us in restaurants or whisper behind our backs. But you know what hurts more? The thought of not being with you. She reached up and touched his cheek gently. You've shown me what real strength looks like. It's not about physical abilities. It's about having the courage to live life on your own terms. You built something amazing here, James. You're changing lives every day, and somehow, along the way, you've changed mine too. James's eyes glistened with tears. You're extraordinary, Sarah Williams. Do you know that? Most people see limitations. You see possibilities. I learned that from you, she replied softly. Just then, Maria knocked on the office door. Sorry to interrupt, she said, using her prosthetic hands to hold up some papers, but the new accessibility software tests are ready for review. James smiled. Want to stay and see what we're working on? He asked Sarah. For the next 2 hours, Sarah watched as James and his team tested new software that would help people with various disabilities use computers more easily. She saw the joy on their faces when something worked perfectly, and the determined problem-solving when it didn't. As she drove home that night, Sarah thought about how different her life had become in just 3 months. She had always thought love would come in a familiar package, the kind her family would easily accept. Instead, it had come in the form of a man who showed her that the only real disabilities in life were fear and prejudice. What she didn't know yet was that their journey together was about to face its biggest challenge, one that would test not just their love, but everything they believed about themselves and each other. 6 months into their relationship, Sarah noticed James acting strangely. He kept checking his phone, having whispered conversations, and changing the subject whenever she asked about his plans for the weekend. As a nurse, she was trained to notice details, and something was definitely different. One Friday evening, James asked her to come to his office after her hospital shift. When Sarah arrived, she found the entire floor transformed. Soft lights twinkled everywhere, and a trail of rose petals led to his private office. Her heart beating faster, Sarah followed the path. When she opened the office door, she gasped. The room was filled with candles, and James sat in his wheelchair wearing a suit, a nervous smile on his face. Sarah, he said softly, come here. As she walked towards him, Sarah noticed his hands were shaking slightly. Behind him, the city lights sparkled through the large windows, creating a magical backdrop. These past 6 months have been the happiest of my life, James began. You came into my world and showed me that love doesn't see barriers. It doesn't care about wheelchairs or skin color or what other people think. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth. I know it won't be easy, he continued. I know we'll face challenges that other couples don't. But Sarah Williams, you make me want to be better every day. You see me for who I am, not what I can't do. He opened the box, revealing a beautiful diamond ring. Will you marry me? Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she nodded. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. James's hands trembled as he slipped the ring onto her finger. They both laughed when it took him 2 tries to get it right. The happiness of their engagement, however, was quickly tested. When Sarah called her mother to share the news, the response was devastating. Mama, please, Sarah pleaded into the phone. Just meet him once. Give him a chance. I will not watch my only daughter throw her life away, her mother replied firmly. What about children? What about your future? Who's going to take care of who? James doesn't need taking care of, Mama. He runs his own company. He helps people. He loves me. Love won't protect you from the hard times, Sarah. Love won't stop people from judging you, a black woman with a disabled white man. I won't support this. The call ended with Sarah in tears and her mother's words ringing in her ears. If you go through with this wedding, don't expect me to be there. That evening, Sarah sat in James' apartment, curled up on his couch while he held her hand. She had just finished telling him about her mother's reaction. Maybe we should wait, she said quietly. Give them more time to accept us. James wheeled his chair closer. Sarah, look at me. When she raised her tear-stained face, he continued, we could wait 10 years, and some people still wouldn't accept us. But I don't want to waste another day not being your husband. Just then, James's phone rang. It was his parents. Sarah held her breath as he answered and put it on speaker. We heard the good news. His mother's excited voice filled the room. Sarah, sweetheart, welcome to the family. When can we start planning the wedding? Fresh tears fell from Sarah's eyes, but this time they were tears of relief and joy. James's parents had been surprisingly supportive from the start, seeing in Sarah the loving partner their son deserved. See, James said after ending the call, we have people in our corner. And the ones who aren't? Well, they'll either come around or they'll miss out on something beautiful. Sarah looked at her engagement ring, then at James. She thought about her mother's words about hard times ahead, but as she watched James smiling at her, his eyes full of love and determination, she knew she had made the right choice. What they didn't know was that their wedding day would bring surprises that would change not just their lives, but the lives of everyone around them, including those who had doubted their love the most. The morning of the wedding arrived with golden sunshine streaming through the windows of the bridal suite. Sarah stood in front of the mirror, her white dress flowing beautifully around her. Lisa, her best friend and maid of honor, was fixing her veil. You look stunning, Lisa said, wiping away tears. I'm sorry I doubted you and James at first. I've never seen you so happy. Sarah smiled, remembering how Lisa had changed her mind after spending time with James and seeing their love firsthand. If only her mother could do the same. The empty chair reserved for her would be a painful reminder of her absence. James's mother, Eleanor Cooper, knocked and entered the room. Over the past months, she had become like a second mother to Sarah, filling the void left by her own mother's rejection. Oh, my dear, Eleanor gasped, her eyes filling with tears. You're absolutely beautiful. She hugged Sarah carefully, mindful of the dress. And I have a surprise for you. Eleanor opened the door again, and Sarah's heart stopped. There stood her father, looking uncomfortable in his suit but with tears in his eyes. Daddy, Sarah whispered. Your mother still won't come, he said gruffly. But I couldn't miss my baby girl's wedding day. He walked over and hugged her tightly. I may not understand everything, but I understand love when I see it. The ceremony was held in the garden of a beautiful historic hotel. James had made sure everything was wheelchair accessible, not just for himself but for several guests who used mobility devices. The aisle was wide and smooth, decorated with flowers on both sides. As Sarah walked down the aisle on her father's arm, she saw James waiting at the altar, looking handsome in his tuxedo. Their eyes met, and everything else faded away. The whispers, the stares, the empty seat where her mother should have been. But the biggest surprise came during their first dance. James had been secretive about it, telling Sarah only to trust him. As the music started, two of his employees wheeled forward what looked like a standing frame with various supports. What's this? Sarah asked softly. James smiled. Something I've been working on with my team. Will you help me? With the assistance of his best man and Sarah, James was carefully transferred into the experimental mobility device. It supported his body while allowing him to stand upright, facing Sarah. Gasps filled the room as James, though still supported by the frame, stood at his full height for the first time in their relationship. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as he took her hands in his. May I have this dance? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. The device allowed James to sway gently with Sarah as they danced to At Last by Etta James. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even some of the hotel staff stopped to watch, touched by the moment. Sarah's father sat in his chair, wiping his eyes repeatedly. Next to him, the empty chair seemed to weigh heavily on his heart. He pulled out his phone and, without telling anyone, sent a video of the dance to his wife. Later, during the reception, James's father gave a touching speech about love that knows no boundaries. Sarah was surprised when her father also stood up to speak. I didn't understand this love story at first, he admitted to the crowd. But watching my daughter and James today, I realized something. Love isn't about what a person can or cannot do. It's not about the color of their skin or the way they move. It's about two hearts choosing each other, despite what the world might say. As Sarah and James cut their cake together, their guests crowded around to take pictures. The photos would later go viral on social media, inspiring thousands of people and challenging society's perceptions of love and disability. What no one at the wedding knew was that this beautiful day was just the beginning. The greatest test of their love, and their greatest triumph, still lay ahead, waiting to unfold in ways none of them could have imagined. 5 years passed quickly for Sarah and James. Their wedding video had gone viral, touching millions of hearts and inspiring countless others to look beyond physical limitations and racial differences. But for the couple themselves, life was about the quiet moments they shared and the dreams they built together. One sunny morning, Sarah walked into the newly opened Cooper Foundation building. The modern glass structure stood proudly in downtown Milwaukee, its design making it fully accessible for people with all types of disabilities. As she passed through the lobby, she smiled at the large photo on the wall. It was from their wedding day, showing their first dance with James in his standing frame. Mrs. Cooper called out Michael, a young man in a wheelchair who worked at the foundation. "Mr. Cooper is waiting for you in the education center." Sarah found James teaching a group of disabled teenagers how to use specialized computer equipment. The foundation had started a program to help young people with disabilities learn technical skills, and James taught classes whenever he could. "And that's how you can code using just voice commands," James was saying as Sarah entered. He looked up and smiled at her. "Everyone, this is my wife, Sarah. She's the reason this foundation exists." After the class, James and Sarah went to his office. The walls were covered with photos of the lives they touched over the years. Children receiving scholarships, adults finding jobs through their employment program, and families getting help with medical equipment. 5 years, Sarah said softly, looking at their wedding photo on his desk. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday." James wheeled over to her side. "Best 5 years of my life," he said, taking her hand. "Though I wish your mother could have been part of them." Sarah's mother had maintained her distance, though she did send Christmas cards now. It was a small step, but Sarah held on to hope. Her father, however, had become one of their biggest supporters, often volunteering at foundation events. "Did you take your medicine this morning?" Sarah asked, noticing James looked a bit pale. Over the past few months, she had noticed him getting tired more easily, but he always brushed off her concerns. "Yes, nurse," he teased, but Sarah saw something flicker in his eyes. Was it worry? Before she could ask more, his phone rang. It was about their latest project, a scholarship program for medical students who wanted to specialize in treating patients with disabilities. James had been working extra hours to get it launched, despite Sarah's concerns about his health. Later that evening, they hosted a small dinner party at their house. Lisa and her husband were there, along with several friends from the foundation. Sarah watched as James told stories and made everyone laugh, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "You built something amazing here," Lisa said, helping Sarah with the dishes after dinner. "Remember when I thought you were crazy for dating him? Now look at all the good you two have done together." Sarah smiled, remembering those early days. "Love has a way of proving people wrong," she replied. After their guests left, Sarah found James in their bedroom, looking through old photos on his tablet. He had pulled up a picture from their honeymoon in Hawaii, where they had found a beach with special wheelchairs that could go on the sand. "We should go back there," Sarah suggested, sitting beside him. James was quiet for a moment, then said, "Sarah, there's something I need to tell you." But before he could continue, his tablet slipped from his hands, and he slumped slightly in his chair. Sarah's nursing instincts kicked in immediately. "James? James?" She called out, checking his pulse and breathing. It was steady, but he was unconscious. As the ambulance raced them to the hospital, Sarah held James's hand tightly. She didn't know it then, but the secret he had been keeping was about to change everything, not just for them, but for all the lives they had touched through their love story. Sarah sat in the hospital waiting room, her nurse's uniform still on from her shift earlier that day. Now she found herself on the other side of healthcare, waiting anxiously as doctors ran tests on James. Her father sat beside her, having rushed to the hospital as soon as she called. "He's been hiding something," Sarah said quietly, twisting her wedding ring. "I could tell. As a nurse, I should have seen the signs earlier." Her father squeezed her hand. "Don't blame yourself, baby girl. That husband of yours can be stubborn when he wants to be." Finally, Dr. Matthews, a longtime friend of both Sarah and James, came out to the waiting room. His face was serious. Sarah, he said gently. James is awake now. He's asking for you, and he has something to tell you. Walking into James's hospital room, Sarah's heart ached seeing him looking so vulnerable in the hospital bed. His wheelchair sat empty beside him, and for a moment, she remembered their first meeting in a room just like this one, 5 years ago. I'm sorry, James said as soon as she entered. His voice was weak, but his eyes were clear. I should have told you long ago. Sarah sat on the edge of his bed, taking his hand. Told me what? James took a deep breath. Remember before we got married, when you asked about my medical history? I didn't tell you everything. He explained that long before his accident, before the wheelchair, he had been diagnosed with a rare genetic condition. The doctors had told his parents he wouldn't live past 30. The wheelchair had nothing to do with it. It was just a separate part of his life story. The accident that put me in this wheelchair, that was real. But this condition, it's why I've been working so hard these past 5 years. I knew my time was limited. Sarah felt her world spinning. As a nurse, she understood exactly what he was telling her. As a wife, she felt her heart breaking. Why didn't you tell me? She whispered, tears falling freely now. James reached up to wipe her tears. At first, I didn't want you to marry me out of pity. Then after we were married, I didn't want our time together to be overshadowed by a countdown. I wanted us to live, Sarah, really live. Sarah thought about all they had accomplished, the foundation, the scholarships, the lives they had changed. It hadn't just been about helping others. It had been James' way of making his limited time count. The doctors gave me 5 years. We've had those 5 beautiful years together, James continued. Every moment with you has been a gift. Every smile, every laugh, every life we touched through our foundation. It's more than I ever dreamed possible. Sarah's nursing training kicked in. There must be treatments, clinical trials. James shook his head. I tried them all, secretly, over the years. That's why I had so many business trips. The treatments helped me stay strong enough to build our legacy, but they can't change the outcome. Just then, there was a knock at the door. To Sarah's shock, her mother stood there, still wearing her church clothes. Mama? Sarah gasped. Your father called me, her mother said softly, stepping into the room. She looked at James with tears in her eyes. All these years, I thought I was protecting my daughter from a hard life. I didn't realize you were the one protecting her, preparing everything for when you'd have to leave her. James smiled weakly. I love her. Everything I've done has been for her. Sarah's mother walked to the bed and took James's other hand. I was wrong about you, she said simply. Can you forgive an old woman's stubbornness? As Sarah watched her mother and husband finally connect, she felt her heart both healing and breaking. But what none of them knew was that James had one final surprise planned. A gift that would ensure their love story would continue to change lives long after he was gone. 2 months after his confession in the hospital, James passed away peacefully in his sleep, holding Sarah's hand. His last days had been filled with love, as family and friends came to say goodbye. Even Sarah's mother had been there every day, making up for lost time by helping care for the son-in-law she had finally come to love. The memorial service was held in the Grand Hall of the Cooper Foundation building. Hundreds of people came, employees, students who had received scholarships, families the foundation had helped, and many others whose lives James had touched. His wheelchair sat empty next to the podium, covered in white flowers. Sarah sat in the front row between her parents, wearing the black dress James had bought her just a month ago, saying she looked beautiful in it. Her father held her hand while her mother kept an arm around her shoulders, the family finally united in their grief. James Cooper changed what people thought was possible, his father said in his eulogy. Not just for people with disabilities, but for everyone who ever faced obstacles in life. He showed us that love knows no boundaries, and that a life's worth isn't measured in years, but in the hearts we touch. After several moving speeches, James's lawyer, Mr. Richardson, stepped forward. James asked me to read something, he said, pulling out an envelope. He wrote this letter a week before he passed. Sarah sat up straighter, her heart beating faster. The lawyer began to read. My dearest Sarah, if you're hearing this, then our time together has come to an end. But our story hasn't. When I first met you in that hospital room, I knew I had limited time. So I made a plan to make that time count not just for us, but for generations to come. I've left something for you, not just the foundation. That was only the beginning. Over the past 5 years, I've been secretly funding full medical school scholarships for underprivileged students who want to work with disabled patients. 20 students are already in medical school because of this program, and there's funding secured for hundreds more. But here's the real surprise. Every scholarship is in your name, not mine. The Sarah Cooper Medical Scholarship Fund will help train doctors who understand that disability doesn't define a person. They'll carry forward the lesson you taught me, that love sees beyond physical limitations. I've also left funding to expand our foundation's work. The new children's wing of the hospital will have a fully accessible playground. Every child, whether they can walk or not, will have a place to just be a kid. Your mother once worried you'd spend your life taking care of me. Instead, you inspired me to take care of others. Now, through these programs, we'll keep taking care of people long after I'm gone. Remember our first dance at our wedding? How I stood with that special frame we developed? That technology has been perfected now. The foundation will provide it free to anyone who needs it. Every time someone stands for their wedding dance or graduates, or just wants to hug their children at eye level, they'll be part of our love story. Sarah, you made my last 5 years feel like a lifetime of joy. You showed me that real love doesn't see obstacles, it sees opportunities. I may have left this world, but our love will keep changing lives. All my love, forever, James. By the time Mr. Richardson finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Sarah's mother held her daughter tightly, whispering, "He was the best man I never gave a chance to know. I'm so sorry, baby." As people came up to share their stories about James, Sarah sat quietly, touching her wedding ring. She thought about their journey, from that first meeting in the hospital, through all the challenges they faced, to this moment. James had known all along that their time was limited, yet he had used every minute to create something beautiful and lasting. Their love story hadn't just changed their lives, it had created a legacy that would continue touching lives for generations to come. In the end, James had given the world so much more than inspiration. He had shown that true love, in whatever form it comes, has the power to transform not just 2 hearts, but countless lives. And somewhere, Sarah knew, James was smiling.